You've heard of high net worth, but we're talking about high net purpose. We want to find out how entrepreneurs, global leaders in our network are allocating financial, human, and intellectual capital in pursuit of purpose. But more importantly, we want to understand the compromises, the paradoxes in their approaches, pitch decks, and philosophies. 2 years ago, at the very start of this podcast journey, we recorded a conversation with Dr. James Doty that left a lasting impression. With news of his recent passing, we felt compelled to revisit and share his wisdom. Dr. Doty was a neurosurgeon, entrepreneur, New York Times bestselling author, and founder of Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. His work fused science with heart, showing how compassion isn't soft, but a powerful force for brain health and human flourishing. In this episode, he shares many frameworks, but 3 in mind that you can use in everyday life are a biological model of how compassion rewires the brain and body for resilience, creativity, and longevity. He offers a simple 3-step practice for self-compassion that shifts your inner voice from critic to ally. And also a leadership lens that shows why compassionate organizations outperform those built on fear. It's a conversation that feels more urgent than ever. May his words inspire you as deeply as they inspired us. This is the James Doty episode. Good morning, James. Welcome to the High Net Purpose podcast.
It's great to be with you, Joseph. It's nice to reconnect. I know we had some challenges the last time we tried to do
We did indeed. But we met many years ago in Los Angeles and then subsequently in London. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. And I genuinely thank you for making the time. So I'm going to start with an easy question for you.
Whenever anyone says I'm starting with an easy question, you might as well get prepared because you're going to be screwed in some way.
Yes.
Right?
So if you if you to distill your life's purpose into a sentence, what would it be?
Be of service to others.
That's good. That's good. So the thing that is incredible about your life is that you've gone from poverty to neurosurgery to being a leading voice on compassion, serving other people. What was the aha moment when you shifted your focus from brain to the heart?
So like many people, young people, we want to be quote unquote successful by what we think of as typical society standards. And that typically is associated with power, position, money. And once we get those, we think our life is going to be perfect and we're going to be happy. And for me, I went to medical school. I became a neurosurgeon, a professor at Stanford University. I became a successful entrepreneur, made millions of dollars. And with each of these accomplishments, I would think, okay, I've done this. Wow, I'm at the top of the hill. And now I'm going to be happy. And every time I climbed that mountain, there was nothing there for me. And the reason is because I was looking for outside affirmation. People to tell me I was okay, I was successful. And what I found was that it never worked. I never felt okay. In fact, from my own background, I carried a lot of shame and insecurity. And other people telling me I was okay did not help me feel okay. And ultimately, what happened is after, if you will, climbing this mountain to typical societal standards of success. During the dot-com crisis, I had heavily invested in a few companies, and most of my net worth was tied up in there. And during the dot-com crisis, I ended up losing $80 million or so. And at that time, that was not an insignificant sum of money. So my penthouse in San Francisco with the private elevator, my Ferraris, my Porsches, essentially everything that I had sort of thought was important and would make me whole and show people that I was whole, it all went away. And in fact, I had a villa in Florence that also went away, and an island I was purchasing in New Zealand. And here I was reflecting on what happened. I I went through a deep reflection. And I wrote a book about some aspects of this called Into the Magic Shop, a neurosurgeon's quest to discover the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart, which ended up being a New York Times bestseller and a bestseller in 8 countries. It's translated into 36 languages. But the reason I mention that is I tell this story because I ended up actually reflecting on what happened. And in the story of the trajectory of my life, I had met a woman who taught me techniques of not only how to deal with my own personal trauma, but how to overcome it. And this was through mindfulness practices and manifesting my intentions, if you will. And so I went back to reflect on what she had taught me. And I'd met this woman when I was 12 or 13. And I realized that I could not become happy by external affirmation. Only I could allow myself to become happy. And while I was never a bad person, I was always focused on the next achievement. And that's really about yourself, what I want, and showing people that you're successful. But I realized through that period of reflection that what would make me whole and fill the emptiness that I was feeling was actually to be of service to others. And so I changed my entire orientation. Certainly being a doctor, you're of service to others, but all of my things to that period of time were really about me. And when I changed how I looked at the world to be of service, to do things for others, to have that always be the primary focus, everything changed. And what I tell people is I went from rags, if you will, to riches, and then to rags. And even though I was $3 million in debt at that time, it was still the best decision I made. And that decision resulted in actually several things happening. One, I started a center at Stanford that was focused on studying the neuroscience of compassion and altruism, which is fundamentally about being kind to yourself, but being kind to others. And then the other aspect was that I ended up meeting the Dalai Lama, who became the founding benefactor of the center. And through that relationship, I connected, if you will, to higher values and insights than I had previously experienced. And from that relationship, I ended up meeting some of the greatest spiritual leaders in the world who become close friends of mine and who I work with frequently. And although the material success, look, I was always a neurosurgeon, so I was never going to starve, but the material success became irrelevant to me. What was most important was, how can I live a life of purpose to care for others and not get lost in, unfortunately, what is defined by success oftentimes by our capitalist society. And unfortunately, you can get so much into that, it becomes this echo chamber of people trying to compete to see how much money they make or what position they have, versus focusing what is most important, which is making life better for others. And as the Dalai Lama says, you know, it's the only time to be selfish, and that's when you care for others, because the benefit you get far outweighs what you've given. And that's not only from a mental perspective, it's from a physiologic perspective.
And when you went to set up the center, and you were coming with the hard skills as a surgeon scientist, how did you convince them to consider compassion and empathy as something in a scientific educational institute would be something that they would be willing to move forward with? Was there a link that you could provide between the data on the science side and what compassion and empathy can do?
Well, it's interesting. This was in 2008, and there had been very little work done in this specific area. In fact, there was no center in the world that was dedicated to the study of compassion per se. And it's funny you bring that up, because for many people, when you mention the word compassion, it immediately falls into this woo-woo, metaphysical, be kind, that's BS sort of perspective. And what I initially did and remember, this is at Stanford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. I initially gathered together a group of neuroscientists and psychologists to talk about this. And it was interesting how they initially told me this was a waste of time and that there's really no reason to study it. But fortunately, for two reasons. One is I funded the research myself, and any scientist typically is always looking for money to do research. So we began a few research projects. Plus, this was a core group of about 6 people. We also started looking at the medical literature and the literature in general. And two things happened. One, we found literature that supported this concept of actually compassion potentially having a lot of power in terms of benefit, self-benefit. And the studies we did confirmed that. And in fact, 2 of the scientists changed their direction of research to actually focus on compassion based on the information that we had found. And then subsequently, we've continued to do research, and we've also resulted in a number of groups throughout the world now focusing on studying compassion, neuroscience of compassion, self-compassion. Now, I certainly don't want to take all that credit, but certainly the center at Stanford we founded, which is called the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, did have a profound impact in this arena. And now it's funny because all of us have heard the word mindfulness or meditation, and it offers a lot of benefit. But now what you're hearing is frequently it's meditation and compassion together, or how you can learn compassion and change your life. So I feel very fortunate that I've been able to contribute to that arena, and actually it has really changed the world. And the center that I run at Stanford, as a result, is really known around the world. We have relationships in South America, Mexico, Finland, Japan, and China, all over the world. And so it's really quite extraordinary. And I shouldn't forget the UK.
But what is that research? Help us understand what that research actually looks like.
Sure. Well, there are many ways to study compassion. One is you can do what we call self-report. So you create an experiment, and then you query the people before and after, and you see what their responses are. The second is that you do imaging studies. And what I mean by that is you use techniques such as magnetic resonance imaging or positron emission tomography. And what these can do is they show areas in your brain, their metabolic activity. As an example, you do a study where you have the individuals have an option of donating money, and this often is college students. You give them a sum of money, and you ask them to make a decision, either donate it to yourself or donate it to others who are in need. And the amazing thing is that when you care for others or you donate to others, those areas in your brain that are associated with pleasure and reward actually increase their metabolism. And so it shows you, and there's an evolutionary explanation for this. It shows you that when you care for others, when you give to others, you are rewarded by having your pleasure and reward center stimulated, which results in the release of various neurotransmitters. One I'm sure you've heard of is oxytocin, the love or nurturing hormone. So that's very, very powerful. And this can translate into a whole variety of other things. When you teach compassion for others, when you teach self-compassion, oftentimes it allows for you to have better emotion regulation, which decreases actually activation of your sympathetic nervous system. And that's what is associated with stress, anxiety, fear, and disgust, and shift you over from engagement of that system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, which is often called the rest and digest system. And when you're in that mode, when you're able to make that shift, magic happens. Your cardiac function improves, your blood pressure is lowered, your immune system is boosted, the expression of inflammatory proteins, which are associated with a variety of chronic diseases, actually diminish. Your stress hormone levels are decreased. Your ability to process information is improved because your executive control area in the brain is actually working at its best. And this allows you to have more access to information, and you become more creative, you become more productive. So essentially, on every level, when you are of service to others, when your life is focused on that, it has a profound, profound impact, ultimately translating into lengthening your telomeres, which are those parts of your genes that are associated with increase in longevity.
I think when we first met, Elizabeth Blackburn was there, who did the work on the in that area on the telomeres, and the actual process of teaching self-compassion, because I can see compassion in terms of serving and helping others, but what does self-compassion look like?
Well, this is what a lot of people, unfortunately, don't have insights into. And in fact, a lot of people in the caring professions like healthcare, they're so focused on helping others that they don't take care of themselves. And as a result, you see high incidences of burnout and actually decreasing efficiency in doing your job. And in fact, many people will leave their job unless that's addressed. And what self-compassion is dealing with the issue that almost everyone has. Actually, I should say everyone does have, some perhaps more than others. And this is the voice in your head that says you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not worthy. And of course, these types of narratives, these negative narratives, then lead to increasing stress, increasing anxiety, and ultimately depression and rumination. And so by giving people techniques, meditation is potentially one of those, that allow you to sit and not have that negative commentary affect you. Because oftentimes when you have these negative thoughts, then you attach to them, and then you start these internal narratives leading to rumination. And so what you can do is actually, and this is typical mindfulness, you can, one, learn to relax your body. This is called a body scan. Because people who are anxious, who are stressed, who've been traumatized, they're often very tense and they can't focus. So at first you teach them to relax the body, if you will, and then you teach them how to focus their mind and train them not to respond to the negative dialogue and go into a dialogue about that dialogue with yourself. But the other aspect, which I think is more powerful, is to actually change the narrative that's going on in your inside of your head. And this is through self-affirmation. And this is what compassion is, where you're changing the narrative, or by analogy, if you think of it as a radio station, you're changing the radio station from one of negative news to positive news. And that news is that you are worthy. You're worthy of love, that you are talented, that you've accomplished many great things. Don't beat yourself up because it wasn't perfect, and all of these things. And by doing that, by learning emotion regulation, you end up not only being happier, but you end up being a much more effective, efficient individual in terms of how you lead your life. And we offer courses for people through the center. And I will tell you, there are innumerable people who have come to me, not only those who've taken the course, but those who love them or their bosses who say, the change in this person is extraordinary. It has changed every aspect of their life because they're much more kind. They're much more thoughtful. They're looking at the world through a different lens. And it is the lens that I would say is now much clearer in that, if you will, you see the true nature of reality. To get back to one of the earlier questions is how did you start the center? First of all, I'm a neurosurgeon, as you pointed out, and it was interesting because I had been doing these initial studies, and one day I was walking through campus, and I don't know why, and you could say this is, in fact, metaphysical, but I had a vision of the Dalai Lama. And to be frank with you, I had no interest in the Dalai Lama. And in fact, a few years before, my wife had bought tickets to attend an event with the Dalai Lama, and I refused to go. So this image comes before me, and I'm walking along, and I cannot shake this image. And basically, it says, you need to ask the Dalai Lama to come to Stanford. And so I ended up tracking him down. And it turned out that an individual who was in the Tibetan Studies program had actually been involved with the Tibetan government in exile. He arranged for me to meet the Dalai Lama, and we had a 15-minute window of time to meet. He and I ended up hitting it off. Our conversation went for an hour and a half. He immediately agreed to come to Stanford. And in fact, he did. And we had an incredible program. And I got closer to him, ultimately leading me actually to become the chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation, which I was for many years. And then the other amazing aspect of it was that it ended up allowing me to meet some of the most extraordinary spiritual and religious leaders in the world, including Pope Francis, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Sadhguru, Eckhart Tolle, and a whole variety of other individuals. And it really impacted how I saw the world and the revelation that being of service to others, caring for others, not only is our purpose in life, but it is the thing that makes us happy, have purpose and meaning, and makes us live longer.
So what was it in that 90-minute session that you had with the Dalai Lama that had him decide that he was going to make the largest, I believe at the time, external investment in the center?
I have no clue. I'm sure it was my incredible charisma that did that. Well, you have to understand, I think, that of course the Dalai Lama's life is centered on compassion, and I think the fact that I would like to, of course, attribute it to my sparkling personality, but I would say primarily it was because I was coming from Stanford, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and I was working on compassion from a scientific perspective. And he's had an interest in neuroscience for many years and has had relationships with other neuroscientists, and obviously really believed in the power of compassion, and validating, if you will, his spiritual practice by scientific research, I think very much appealed to him.
Got it. And the I think you mentioned before as well how in another conversation the wisdoms that we took from the East, people practice mindfulness, but the element that doesn't seem to have come across was the compassion component, and that is a central part of a lot of those wisdoms.
No, you're absolutely correct. I think that the person who primarily brought this to the West was John Kabat-Zinn. And he did if you will, a strip down or a modification of traditional Buddhist practice, which includes, of course, the mindfulness part or the relaxation, the breathing, the focus, not responding to external narratives in your head. But the problem was that I believe the most important part was the compassion part, and certainly the self-compassion part. And in some ways, that's what we have designed into the programs that we do. When I talked to John about this, he said, well, it was meant to be implicit, but not explicit. But frankly, it needs to be explicit, if you will, for you to really get it. And so that's really what we focused on. And so going back a minute to what you said, though, what unfortunately is quite sad is you have individuals who come from the East, where we have some of the greatest wisdom traditions that have spanned thousands and thousands of years, and they're unfortunately deluded into the narrative that we have something in the West that will improve their lives. And you have these people who have lived in these countries, and they're not rich in any way, but they have shelter, they have security, they have enough to eat. And, they'll come here and they'll find that it's a false narrative, that we have been sold on a narrative, which I've talked about earlier, which is conspicuous consumption, displays of wealth, somehow result in meaning and purpose, and they do not whatsoever. And you have this unfortunate situation where people come here. Now, oftentimes it's because there's strife and war in their countries, and I can certainly appreciate that. But they'll come here and they'll find that there's really nothing here for them other than unhappiness, because so many people are focused on getting ahead, if you will, and they're not focused on self-reflection and understanding the deeper truths about the world. And so it's unfortunate.
But is that drive, that hunger, not what drives mankind forward?
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, which is this striving for improvement is a motivator for people. But if you look at, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the blue zones.
Yep, Dan Buettner.
Yes, so the blue zones are these areas for the audience in the world where people typically live to be over 100. They're typically villages where people are born, where they die. Everyone knows them. And the reason they live so long is because that their purpose is within a community, and it's a community that has known them their entire lives and accepts them for as they are. And unfortunately, what happens in Western society is that we are not in that situation whatsoever. And we're striving for what we think is the definition of success. And we don't have relatives near us. We don't have people who are constantly affirming our goodness and by example, showing us how to be good people, to care for others. And we're incredibly fearful of judgment. And this is actually what's causing a lot of the mental health issues. You're absolutely correct that striving to improve the world is a wonderful thing. But the confusion is, what has happened is, within that is, yes, I want to change things, do things that will have an impact, and I want to get paid for it. And unfortunately, what happens is the driver is no longer doing good in the world for the sake of doing good. The driver is, how can I maximize profit? And that is the problem. As an example, in the world, there are plenty of resources such that no one should be hungry. There should be shelter for everyone. Everyone should be allowed to thrive as a human being, whether that's through education, training, spiritual, religious practice, whatever. But we've had a mass change. And it is, in many ways, a sad narrative that so many people strive to have more and more, such that there is never enough. I mean, I met a young man who was in his late 30s, early 40s, and he said, I'm worth $300 million now, and I'm shooting for $1 billion. And I said, well, what are you going to do with that? He goes, well, after I get that, I'm going to shoot for $2 billion. I go, but what are you doing with that? and buying multiple houses or buying a $100 or $250 million yacht, what is the purpose of that? Now, you could sit there and say, I'm an idiot. The purpose is to lay out in the sun and relax and be acknowledged for being incredibly, quote unquote, successful. Listen, I enjoy these things as much as anyone else. But when the cost is to, let's say you go to some island or some place and you're, taken around in your private car or you're sitting on your boat looking at the coastline, and then you're driving through a city where people are on the street starving, that juxtaposition for me is very, very powerful. Why am I here? What is my purpose? And I'm sure you would probably agree that no one gets out of here alive. And leaving your children hundreds of millions of dollars, at least if you look at the statistics, more likely will not than not destroy their lives. So why, and I know there's a huge movement to try to educate children of the wealthy or high net worth individuals to have purpose and meaning, but it's really hard. And I congratulate and commend those who've been able to do it successfully. But unfortunately, what happens many times is nothing is out of reach, because one of the things that causes us to strive or even to have purpose is to chase something, right? You want to make something happen. You want to change the world. And part of it is because you have this need to achieve, but also when you have everything given to you, whether it's, a house, a car, whatever, and you're young, oftentimes this leads you to be bored easily because you're not striving for anything and nothing's forcing you to strive to change the world, or you haven't been inculcated with that idea of your purpose in life is to be a benefit and to be of service. And it's hard to do because, unfortunately, sometimes there'll be situations where, people will have children, but they're always busy flying off here and there, and their children are at home being supervised by others. And this, of course, leads them many times to go off into partying and to drugs. And then, of course, we know what the outcome of that can be.
But this isn't just a issue for the ultra rich. This is a wider societal issue, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. No question. And I totally agree with you. I'm not trying to say that all the ills of the world are from the rich. They are not whatsoever. I certainly would suggest, though, that many of the ills of the world, though, are manifested by people not having enough, and I think that is a challenge. In fact, there was a recent study where Princeton University examined, from a political perspective, how change occurs or how legislation is passed. And interestingly enough, they said those who had zero interest in changing the world, if you will, and those who had a significant interest in, let's say, policies that would benefit the average person, the likelihood of that actually becoming legislation was minimal from a political perspective. And it said, though, and it showed this graph where it put basically the number of people who were interested in it and wealth, actually. And it showed that those people who had access either through lobbyists, corporate, financial, their ability to pass legislation more accurately followed the narrative of more people want this, and therefore that legislation gets passed, than for that of the typical voter. So what that means is if you do have access to the levers of power, which frankly you have to admit most people do not, then the likelihood of you getting what you want is dramatically increased. And we see this. I mean, as an example, how is it possible that, and I don't have the exact numbers, but I think this gives the point, but during the COVID period, I think there was $1.7 trillion made from that, and it went into the hands of the highest 1 or 2% of the individuals. Or, as you know, I think, 30% of the net worth of the world is in the hands of 8 families or people. I mean, how do you explain that?
Through your research, have you seen any learnings that you could share that will help us with young people to create purpose in their life?
Sure. And I think there's a lot. I think, but again, even for average people, treating your children or teaching your children values is really, really hard, especially when there's so many distractions, and especially in a Western capitalist society, especially in the U.S., where there is this idea of rugged individualism, which is, I did it, I have to have it, it's me, and it makes it really hard. But I think the most powerful one, is to show by example. Children learn by watching those around them. And if there's nothing you do in your life that benefits others, that in a larger sense, and I'm not saying, you give $100 to charity or something like this, but where you're actually engaged in a foundation, a project that is being of service to others, and have them get involved with it. Because the thing is, when you learn early the importance of this, and you actually live that experience of seeing the power you have had to benefit the life of others, that gets embedded into your brain, and that for many children will become their mission and purpose in life. And nothing is actually better than to have the ability and the resources to help others. And that creates a life of true meaning. So I think modeling yourself for children, and also giving them the opportunities, and frankly, making them work in the real world. It's interesting if you, let's say, have to work at a fast food restaurant or mop the floors or be a janitor. That gives you a reality check of how most people live. And it's not pleasant. It's funny. I have a daughter who's in her 40s, and she's had the best education. And she is an artist, and she lives, if you will, a bohemian lifestyle, which I would tell you is in poverty, basically. and that works for her. But the difference is she has a safety net, which is her father. So if it gets really bad, then she'll ask for help, although she almost never does. In fact, I force her to take help. But my point is that living in the real world, seeing how real people live, how people struggle. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that the average person in the U.S., as an example, only has $400 of discretionary income if a disaster happens in their life. I mean, $400. And you think about that, for most of us, you'd be terrified. And imagine a situation, and again, I can only speak of the U.S., but, we have people who are not getting paid a living wage, but a minimum wage, which 2 people working full time cannot live on that, much less take care of their children or own a home, which is quite different than it was 30 or 40 years ago, where you could be a technical worker or a blue-collar worker and take care of your family and actually be happy. The stress of food security, something like 40% or so of children, it's 20% of children are in poverty. They don't have enough to eat. You have massive food insecurity. You have massive housing insecurity. People are terrified they can't pay their rent. And we've seen a decimation of the middle class, where we've seen corporate income dramatically increase into 700-800% over the last several decades. And while there was a theory of trickle-down economics, it, of course, was a false narrative. And so we've seen the decimation of the middle class, where they're essentially the majority of people are the working poor. So giving individuals a sense of that reality and compassion and empathy for them to be of service, to give, when frankly it has no impact on many of their lifestyles.
So you've been a philanthropist for a long time. Does giving money away, is that the solution? Does that work? And what have you learned from your philanthropy?
I know the intellectual trap you're trying to get me into here, which is just giving money away doesn't help, and therefore that's why I don't give money away. Well, I would argue a few things with you. One, and because there's a whole narrative about, well, you have to make it sustainable. Well, how do you make feeding poor children sustainable, right? I mean, there are some things you can give money to, and they can have a profound, profound impact. That being said, I totally agree with you that there is a lot of waste and corruption oftentimes. So I understand that as well. But I think that there are a number of well-regarded charities and organizations that, in fact, are not frivolous with the money at all, and most of it goes to actually help those in need. But no, just giving money is not the solution. But I would also make the following statement. If we look at giving individuals, what is it called, a minimal income, or the
universal?
Universal income. In multiple examples, that's had a profound effect on people's lives. So sometimes you can just give money, and it will have a profound effect on people's lives. But I think it's, there's not necessarily one answer for everything. And you can't use one narrative to say, well, all that money is wasted and it's frivolous. Well, spending $5 million for a birthday party, some people might consider frivolous.
Because the whole act of giving is complicated.
Absolutely.
When you give, you take. The Rousseau, there's no such thing as a purely philanthropic act. And the ability to be able to give, but to be able to help people rather than it being the wealthy giving to the poor type model, which...
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the wealthy giving to the poor. That's a pretty good model, I think. But I think what we're getting at is how can you do it most efficiently? Now, there is a narrative of effective altruism, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And this is this idea that we will, if you will, mathematically, scientifically determine how best this money should be spent. And in an idealistic point of view, that is true. In reality, it's not quite as simple as that. As an example, let me compare and contrast here. If you were to compare parts of Africa with India, and billions of dollars have been dumped into Africa. If you were to say, I have X number of dollars, where could I best use that money? Well, if you look at India, you have individuals who come from the poorest of the poor areas and who, by whatever mechanisms, become educated and become contributing citizens. Where you can look at a whole lot of Africa, and for whatever reason, after millions of or billions of dollars have been put there, it hasn't had a significant impact on changing the lives or creating a pathway for that type of success. So you could argue, well, then I should focus on India and forget Africa. Well, that's a pretty harsh thing to say. Who decides who is better to live or die? Is it the people who, for whatever reason, whether it's culturally or through the mechanisms of their society, end up being more successful? They deserve, if you will, quote unquote, to live. And those who've actually suffered and been impoverished, frankly, many for in many ways by colonialism? Is that so they are not worthy? How do you decide who is worthy? And the narratives that are used sometimes I don't think are reasonable, realistic, or fair. But in an ideal sense, yes, effective altruism can be helpful. But there are a number of articles that will debate that, frankly.
For the business leaders, entrepreneurs who are listening, and the investors, is there a way to integrate compassion into a business model without sacrificing profitability or in fact actually increasing it? Have you seen any examples?
I could quote you innumerable examples. And in fact, there's an entire narrative. And in fact, at the center I run, we actually train corporate entities, whether it's leadership, middle management, or the individual workers, because there are innumerable studies that show, one, this idea, and in some ways it's the same narrative that went with, well, if we ban smoking in restaurants, our restaurant is going to fail. Remember that argument? And of course, it did not whatsoever. And so there's this narrative that goes, well, if we're too kind to people, our business is going to suffer because we're not going to make any profitability because people are lazy or they're not going to work and they're just going to take this as corporate welfare. And that's not true at all. Zero. What happens is, as an example, if you orient your company around kindness and compassion, and this is not woo-woo stuff, this is actually based on science. If an individual is working at a company and they don't find any meaning or purpose in working for that company, they are not going to be engaged. They're going to do the minimal amount, especially if they're treated like they're a widget that is easily replaceable. So if you create a narrative, and there are some companies that manufacture things that you might sit there and say, geez, really, am I doing anything here? I'm making this little widget. It doesn't have an impact. And let's say in that example, you then offer people a different slight narrative saying, look, what we're doing helps a lot of lives. It employs you. But we want to, as an example, work together to help other people. So we're going to have the ability where we'll have each of you work 1 day a month or 3 days a month or whatever it is to do some activity, volunteer activity, to make the world a better place. Or we're going to allocate a certain amount of our profits to improve the world. And we're going to have you, the employees, determine what entities that we're going to support. And you see, when you give that narrative, first of all, it gives people a sense that they're able to do something positive, and it changes the entire narrative. If you're in a situation where the goal of the employer is, I'm going to give the absolute minimum wage, I'm not going to give any benefits, everybody's replaceable, you have massive turnover and you have low productivity. And it's been shown over and over again. When you give people meaning and purpose, you cannot pay them enough to work as hard as they will work for you, because they are appreciative, they're thankful, and they see that you actually care about the world, and you recognize their dignity as a human being, not as a replaceable widget if they don't perform. And the goal cannot be, I want to be maximally extractive with my employees. And there's an interesting example with a guy who, his last name is Carnes, C-A-I-R-N-S, and he was in the Asia, Australia area. But he, and I don't have the exact facts, but I'm paraphrasing, but the ultimate truth is there. He was an individual who he asked for a 360 review, which is common in the corporate world, right? Where they look at all the different leaders and the middle management, et cetera, to see, how people respond if they're good leaders. And in this instance, what happened is they came back to him and they said, we've been doing this for 15 years, and you have absolutely the worst scores of anyone as a CEO we have ever met. And the morale in your company sucks, and on and on and on. None of it was favorable. And he went home and he was because he was thinking of just firing this company because obviously they didn't know what they were talking about, right? Which is our natural response when people are critical of us. So he went home to his wife. He said, "Can you believe it? They did this review on me. They said I was the worst person, and I did this and I did that." And he goes, "What do you think of that?" And she looked at me and said, "They're absolutely correct." He goes, "How come you've never told me that?" She says, "I've been telling you that." So it put this individual on this path where he became very self-reflective. He ended up actually looking at Buddhist practice, and he changed the entire purpose or a structure of the company to do exactly what I just told you. And in a short period of time, not only did productivity dramatically increase, but employee wellness dramatically increased, and their stock price dramatically increased. And this story is being told over and over and over again. And his statement was, "I acted that way out of fear. That was always my narrative, that I'm going to fail. I have to do this. I have to do this." And it translated me into being incredibly mean and brutal to people. And when I turned around and looked at people as human beings and was kind and compassionate and thoughtful, that changed everything for me, and it changed his company. And so that's just one example, but there are innumerable examples. And actually, we are about to start training about 30,000 employees in middle management and leadership in 3 companies in the next year or so because of the power of this. And it's really quite amazing. So yes, you can sit there and make the argument that you should be a ruthless business person and maximally extract because that's how you're going to be successful. But that gives you short-term success. It doesn't give you long-term success. And actually, evolutionary biology shows this as well. In fact, there's a fellow by the name of Robert Sapolsky, who you may have heard of. He studies different types of primates. But his statement is, and again, I'm paraphrasing, his statement is that those groups that are most kind and supportive are much more successful in the long term than those who have an alpha leader who basically is ruthless. So the science is there. And even Darwin made this statement that it's not about the survival of the fittest, which is a common quote that people use to justify their behavior. He never said that. This was said by an economist by the name of Hobbes, who had an underlying agenda for that statement. What Darwin said, it is the survival of the most sympathetic or compassionate that allows the long-term survival of a species. And I think those individuals are absolutely correct, and I think science is demonstrating this. You know, it's easy to get into a narrative and oftentimes an echo chamber where you repeatedly make statements which you end up believing are true, but in fact are not true at all. And I think that's the case here.
Phenomenal. Thanks, James. The journey that we've taken from, we started with some of your origin story. It goes much deeper, and I'd encourage anybody to read your book or listen to some of the other podcasts which go deeper into that origin story, which is incredible. We've talked a bit about setting up the center. We've talked about policy and then organizations, but maybe taking it back to the individual at the end. In a busy world, and you yourself have got so much going on. You're a polymath covering. You've got a new book that maybe we can cover before we finish, coming out shortly. How do you remain compassionate?
Well, if you ask my wife, I'm not. I'll tell you, one time she got really mad at me and she said, people call you Mr. Compassionate. You're just an asshole. So none of us are perfect human beings.
We're not, but like the work that you do in teaching compassion as a when you're practicing doctor, all of that is evidently hugely. But at the personal level, um, uh, reflecting on what you said about how much you can give back to us if we are compassionate. Um, how do you deal with the busyness?
On the one hand, I am busy. And, I'm sure you've heard the statement, if you want to get something done, ask a busy person. Um, so my purpose, based on, the conversation we had earlier, is to talk the talk and walk the walk. Now, that does not mean I'm perfect, and I'm a human being, and I fail, and I accept full responsibility for that. But in general, I always look at the world through the lens of how can I be helpful? And how can I use what knowledge I have to help people see the world through the lens of compassion and not self-interest? Because if you're compassionate, you, at the end of the day, still get everything you want. And does it really make a difference whether you made, $100 million versus 75 at the end of the day, when that $25 million could have changed the lives of thousands and thousands of people? You just have to, one, be able to say, this is enough, and get out of the rat race of saying, which is very common in the US, I have to win, I have to be in charge, I'm going to beat this person. Sometimes you beat the person by actually being the most kind, not being the most ruthless. Yes, I'm really busy. I run the center, of course. I actually started a company, if anyone is interested, that deals with mental health. We have a mental health crisis in the world. It's in some ways exacerbated by some of the things we're talking about, how society is becoming more and more harsh. So so we train people different techniques or practices, how to be more kind and compassionate, and also deal with their own stress and anxiety. So the company I mentioned actually is called Happy, HAPPI.ai. And we've actually developed an app that uses emotion assessment combined with a conversational proprietary AI that is imbued with a psychology and compassion-focused therapy database that sits on top of an LLM that is connected to a human avatar. And amazingly, and while there are various chatbots and things like this, talking to this avatar who looks just like you or me, in this case, though, it's a woman initially, actually, with just a 5-minute conversation or less, can dissipate most people's stress and anxiety, especially if it comes on suddenly. I'm not talking about, chronic depression and things like this. I'm talking about situations where you can become stressed and anxious, and also especially at night for people who, without the distraction of the world, they suddenly get very stressed and anxious. So this is available 24/7. It is compassionate and empathic, and it is non-judgmental. And a bit earlier, we talked about, in modern society, the absolute terror and fear that people have of being judged. And this accepts you as you are, where you're at, and nothing is better than that. And we talked about the blue zones in the world. The reason people live longer there is because there's no judgment. They accept you for as you are. They talk to you in a loving, kind fashion. They understand that we all make mistakes, and in that sense, then, it creates a sense of psychological safety. And that's what we all want, to be in a place where people understand that we're human beings, that we're trying to do the best we can, which is, I think, the case for almost all people, and that sometimes we just need a little help. And this is, I think, the important message here is that, yes, it's great. Listen, as I told you, I had a penthouse, I had a villa, I had Porsches and Ferraris. I love them, but I don't need them. And I don't. And the thing is that it's great, but by far and away the best satisfaction I have ever had in my life has nothing to do with that. It has to do with being able to lift somebody up, to be of service, and help them. And every one of us has that ability. And it has nothing to do with wealth. Whether you're the poorest person in the world, sometimes just smiling at somebody, sometimes buying somebody a meal, sometimes opening a door, sometimes seeing somebody deep in thought and simply saying, how can I help you? These are little things that can be very, very powerful. And you can imagine if we look through that lens, no matter what our status in society, there's so many areas where we could improve the lives of other people. And by doing so, fill the emptiness that so many of us have. And unfortunately, sometimes people try to fill it with stuff. And this is, I talked about people coming from the East. You try filling it with stuff and they realize that that's a false narrative. It has to be related to doing things for other people. And so I think that's really the most important message.
So I would encourage people to check out that the website for the new company. I've seen a demonstration of the avatar. It's phenomenal. And again, how you've brought so many different groups together to deliver that technology as fast as you have is incredible. Thank you for the compassion and the time that you've given us today and patience to get this done. It's been a real privilege. Thank you for the time today and for all that you do.
Well, and thank you for having me. And again, all we have to do is be kind to others, and life will be good.
All content of High Net Purpose is provided as general information only. It does not constitute any advice, recommendation, or representations, and is not intended to influence listeners or users into making any specific investments or any other decisions. Please be aware that guests and presenters on High Net Purpose may have investments in any of the topics or products being discussed. Their reviews and opinions are their own and should not be taken as endorsements or financial advice. Before making financial decisions, we strongly recommend seeking advice from a qualified financial professional. This podcast may not be copied, reproduced, further distributed, or published in whole or part.